I want to talk about creating stunning visual textures in watercolour in this video. I'll demonstrate some simple techniques you can use, and I'll put some of those techniques to use when I paint this old door in watercolour. Why should you include texture in your watercolour paintings? Quite simply, texture adds interest and visual appeal. It adds contrast and it can break up the monotony of flat areas. You can use texture to direct the viewer's eye to a particular area of the painting, and you can create different moods with it. If you get value from my tutorials, please give this video a like and make sure you subscribe as well so that you don't miss any future videos. Alright, let's dive in and have a look at a few simple techniques for creating texture, and then I'll put some of the techniques I demonstrate into use on this painting. I'm painting on the back of a painting that failed here. I've got it taped to my board. Probably the most common technique I use to create visual texture is by including deliberate blooms on my painting. I have an entire video about watercolour blooms here on YouTube if you want to know more about them. I'll get an area ready here on this paper to show you, and then I'll move on to another technique. That area is too wet at the moment for me to create a watercolour bloom, so I'll let it sit there for a little while. Here I'm going to put some paint on the paper, and I'm going to drop some Winsor & Newton granulating medium into it. I have never used granulating medium before, but I have admired the results of using it on other paintings, so I recently bought some for myself and I'll try it out here. This is it here, so I'm going to use a pipette to draw some of it out of the bottle. I saw on YouTube that you can mix this into your paint mixture instead of using water, but here I'm just dropping it onto the wet paint. I'll let that sit there, and then hopefully we'll be able to see some granulation happening. Coming back to this other area that I painted first, I'll drop some water onto that. It's not as wet as it was, so the paint is starting to dry. And when I drop the water on there, it disperses the pigment that's drying and it creates those little organic shapes that you can see. Here I've got some ink. The colour is sepia. I'll be using this on the door painting that I'll show you in a little while, but I'll demonstrate here what I'll be doing with it. I've got a little spray bottle here that sprays a really fine mist. I'll be using that as well. I'll make a few random marks with the ink and my rigger brush. And then before that ink dries, I don't spray too close, I move away a little bit. When I spray it, that disperses the ink and creates some interesting marks. If I spray too close to the paper, it spreads the ink too far and makes a bit of a mess. I have tried this with watercolour, but I find I get a more dramatic result when I use ink. Okay, here's another way to create textural marks. This is a sea sponge that I've dampened with some water. I take that sponge, I dip it into some French ultramarine that I've got here, and then I press it onto the paper to create some texture. I've seen other artists use sea sponges to paint trees in, which I think is interesting. Something else you can do with the sea sponge is to take some paint off the paper. So if I paint a little patch of wet paint just here, I'll show you what I mean. My sponge is slightly damp. I'm going to press it onto the wet paint, and that absorbs some of the paint and creates a textural mark there. You can do the same thing with some paper towel scrunched up or some plastic cling wrap as well, even foil. Here I've got a bit of paper towel, I'll scrunch it up, and then I dab that onto the paint while it's still wet. Takes a bit of paint off and creates those marks. And the other thing you can do to create texture is to dry brush onto the paper. When you dry brush, that doesn't mean the brush is dry. Here I've got a brush that is quite wet. I've just dipped it in my water container. I'm just going to take off a little bit of moisture, not a lot. I need it to be damp, so not sopping wet, but not dry either. And when I hold the brush to do the dry brushing, I hold it away from the ferrule, so back along the handle. When I load my brush with paint, I do the same thing that I always do, although I make sure that my paint mixture isn't too thin. Normally when I paint, I use the tip of the brush. Now I'm going to use the side of the brush. And that's why I hold my hand back on the back edge of the brush so that I can get to the side of the brush. And I rub it along the paper sideways. And that makes a textural mark. Dry brushing is not easy. It requires a bit of practice. Sometimes you might get those big marks there that you don't want when you first place your brush on the paper. When I paint the door painting, you'll see me run the brush over the brickwork like this. Okay, I'll just go back to the area where I used the granulation medium. It's not great, but just here you can see a bit of granulation. Also, just along here. It's not a great example. It didn't work as well as I had hoped. But I'll be using this on the door when I paint that, so you'll see it work better there. Another way of creating visual texture on your paintings is to use salt. Here I've got some ordinary sea salt. With sea salt texture, it's all in the timing. I have mixed results when I use it. This technique requires a bit of practice as well, because if you put the salt on to the wet paper too early, nothing will happen. And if you put it on a bit too late as the paint is starting to dry, again, nothing much happens. I have a full video on YouTube where I demonstrate how I use it from time to time. Here it is here after it had dried and I had brushed most of the salt off. Here's one of my bird paintings where I've used salt to create some texture on the neck and also on the back. And here's some funky looking camels that I painted where I've used salt to create texture on the fur. And here's another way. I've got wet paint on the background and here I'm using some cling wrap to place over the top of the wet paint. And then I use my fingers to move the cling wrap around to create some textural marks underneath. That needs to dry now. And I'll show you what it looked like after it had dried. There's the finished painting there, so you can see those textural marks that the cling wrap has made on the background. Okay, there's a few examples. There are more, but I rarely use any others, so I just wanted to show you some of the techniques that I use. Now I want to show you how I put some of those techniques into use on the old castle door painting. Before I do that, I must thank Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Skillshare is an online learning platform with thousands of classes on lots of different topics. I've said before that I like to think of myself as being a lifelong learner, so I'm often on Skillshare taking some of the classes. I don't know about you, but I tend to be my own worst critic and I self-sabotage all the time. For the past 2 years, Dom has wanted me to organise an overseas painting workshop. And I have come up with all the excuses under the sun as to why I can't do that. And I know they're just excuses. I'm too busy, or it's COVID, or it's some other reason. Then I stumbled upon this class by Emma Gannon, and it really resonated with me. It's called Unlocking Your Potential, 5 Exercises to Build Creative Confidence. Emma is a best-selling author, and in this class, she helps you to identify those negative habits in your life that stop you from reaching your full potential. And she gives you some tools to help you unlock your creative power. I think acknowledging that there's a problem is always the first step. And after doing the class, I realised that I often get in my own way. And I know now that I need to stop doing that. There's a heap of classes like Emma's that help you with your self-development, And there are other classes on productivity and time management and how to diversify your income as well. And I can't wait to get into all of them. Thanks to Skillshare, you have the opportunity to explore the class library completely free for 1 month. The first 1,000 people to use the link will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. I've put the link right up the top in the description of the video. So if you haven't used Skillshare before, go and check it out. You won't be disappointed. And while you're there, have a look at some of my watercolour classes. Okay, let's have a look now at how I used some of the techniques that I showed you to paint the castle door. Here's the reference photo that I used. I downloaded this from Pixabay. The first thing I did was mix some permanent rose with some indigo to make a violet colour that I was going to use on the background. That's permanent rose and this is indigo. Might put a bit more permanent rose into that, I think. Doesn't need to be mixed really well. And then I also got some yellow ochre. I mixed that with a bit of water because I didn't want it to be too dark. I had transferred my line drawing to my stretched watercolour paper and then I wet the entire paper with some clean water. This is Arche cold press watercolour paper. I started with yellow ochre and I painted that on over most of the paper, and as I said, I wanted it fairly pale. So really quickly all over the wet paper there. And then while it was still wet, I got some of the violet mixture and I painted that in the top left corner. I'm getting a bit of water on my brush so that I can soften away some of those edges. I'm painting flat on the table here, but I will raise my board soon so that the paint flows down to the bottom. I also painted some of that colour down in the bottom right corner. I'm holding the brush away from the ferrule so that I can paint really loosely. Just getting it on there as quickly as I can. And then I raised the board so that it was on more of an angle, just to allow the paint to drift down to the bottom. And then I let that dry a little bit, and then I dropped in some water to create some blooms. So here I've got water on my brush. The paper is still wet, the paint's still wet, but it is starting to dry, and that water that I drop in there disperses the pigment and creates those organic shapes. So I place them where I want them. I look for where the paper is drier than other areas, and that's where I drop the water on. And I'll do the same thing down the bottom here to create a nice bloom down here. And then I need to let it sit and dry. So I let it sit flat on the table when it dries. And this is what it looked like after it had dried. And I really love that bloom right down in the bottom right corner. Then I thought I'd get some colour on the door. So with the door, I wet the paper, but I didn't wet it all the way down to the bottom. I wanted to do some dry brushing on the bottom of the door. Here I'm using a mixture of burnt sienna and indigo, and I start to paint that onto the wet section of the door, painting it carefully around the brickwork. Down the bottom here, I've hit the dry paper, so now I'll use the side of my brush and I'll see if I can get some texture down the bottom. Just a sweep of the brush using the side. As I run it along the bottom of the door, I want a bit of control, so I use the tip of the brush then. And then back to the side of the brush to get those textural marks. This is only the first layer of paint. I will be layering some more paint over the top, and some of these will disappear, but you will still see some of the marks that I'm making now. Once I had painted in the door, I dipped my brush in my water container, and then I used the residue paint that was on it to create a few textural quick brush marks at the front. Once the door was completely dry, I wet it with some water again because I wanted to darken the top left corner with some really dark paint. I used a mixture of indigo and burnt sienna again, but it's got more pigment this time so that the paint is quite a bit darker than what I used for that first layer of paint. This time when I wet the paper, I didn't wet the top left corner, I left that dry. So I wanted the paint quite dark up there, but then when it hits the water down lower, I'll get a soft paint edge. I took it down a bit lower than what I was anticipating. I ended up actually taking it along the bottom left edge as well. I dragged some of the paint down over the pencil lines to form the planks of wood. Then I tilted my board a little and I got some of the granulation medium and I dropped that on while it was still wet. And here it is dry, and you can see what the granulation medium has done there to the pigment. So that's a better example than the one I showed you at the start of the video. Here's another thing that I did. I mixed some really thick pigment for myself. So in my little plastic palette here, I've got some burnt sienna and some indigo, and I'm mixing them together with very little water on my brush. I want a really thick mixture of it, creamy paint. And when I put this paint on the wet paper, it will stick to it like glue. Just scraping the paint off here. I'll quickly check the colour on my palette. I ended up putting a bit more burnt sienna in it because I wanted it a bit more brown than that. Then I took some of that thick creamy paint and I scooped it into the little well beside that one. And then I put a bit of water into the second mixture. And that way I had two wells of dark colour, one with a little bit more water in it, and one that was really thick and creamy, almost pure pigment. So then I used my rigger brush and the really thick pigment, so the pigment that I didn't put any water in, and I painted that over my pencil lines to define the planks of wood that made the door. I didn't paint this all the way down, just in a few areas. I didn't want straight lines running all the way up and down the door. I also painted in the little handle while it was on the wet paper as well. So this thick pigment, not only is it really super dark, but because it's so thick, it stays in place. So even though the paper's wet while I paint this on, it stays in place and it gives me soft paint edges as well, because I don't want hard lines running up and down here. Okay, I was happy with that so far. I dried it off really well and then I wet the bottom section because I wanted to darken the colour along there. So here I'm working on the wet paper with the dark mixture that has a little bit of water mixed into it. I do want this paint to move over the wet paper. So that's why I've used the mixture with a bit more water mixed into it. It's still nice and dark, but it has a bit of movement. I painted in the arch above the door on wet paper. I used yellow ochre first, and then I got some of the darker colours that I mixed. This is the mixture of burnt sienna and indigo. This is the mixture with a bit of water mixed into it so that it flows and bleeds. And then I started to use the thicker mixture of that dark colour. I also brushed a bit more yellow ochre on as well, this time a bit darker. The paper's still wet here. For the area above the arch, I worked on wet paper as well. Here I used the thick creamy pigment and my rigger brush, and I suggested the edges of the brickwork. I didn't want to put too much detail in this area up here. I wanted to paint in the darker areas that ran down the bricks at the front. So I thought I'd paint that on wet paper, but I'll use burnt sienna. I could have used yellow ochre here, but I decided I wanted it a bit bolder and warmer. So I used the burnt sienna instead. So here I'm wetting the paper with water, fair amount of water because I want the paint to flow over the paper. This is burnt sienna. It's fairly dark, so I've used a fair amount of pigment, but as I said, I've mixed water with it so that it will flow down the paper. Then I lifted my board off the table and allowed it to drip down the paper. I kept getting more pigment. And then I wet this other side and I did the same thing here. I lifted it off the table to allow it to drip down to the bottom. I allowed all of that to dry and then I re-wet the paper with some water. Here I've got the thick dark pigment and I'm using the rigger brush to paint over the edge of the bricks. I want the paint to bleed, but gently. I don't want it to spread too far. I mixed up a bit more paint, this time with more burnt sienna in it. So it's a mixture of burnt sienna and indigo, but it's got more burnt sienna in it. So I wanted more of a dark chocolate brown colour. And I also used some burnt sienna on its own with none of the indigo mixed with it. Just painting it onto the wet paper and allowing it to bleed. And here on my brush I've got the mixture of burnt sienna and indigo, but it's got more water mixed into it so that it's not as dark, it's not as thick. It's more of a grey colour. I'm holding the brush loosely and I paint little squiggles with it, just on the wet paper. And here's where I got my brush and I did a bit of dry brushing, so using the side of the brush, rubbing it over the paper. That gives a bit of a texture to that area there. I'm working on wet paper again here with the dark brown mixture that's got a bit of water mixed with it. I want the paint to bleed a little bit, create those little dark edges. And then I pick up the really thick pigment and I start to paint that on in a few areas as well while it's wet. And now, because I showed you how I used the ink on the sample section at the start of the video, I thought I'd put a bit of ink on my painting just to show you. I apply the ink with my long tipped round brush, just on the dry paper. So I squirt it and then it runs. It's a good colour and it's also the perfect consistency for what I want, so it saves me from mixing some paint. So before that dries, I give it a squirt. You can see it gives me all those spidery lines which help to add texture to the painting. And then of course I can use it like I use the watercolour paint, and I just paint over the wet paper and it bleeds there as well. I can also paint on dry paper and leave it dry if I want to, or give it a squirt. I did the same thing on this other side. I worked on the wet paper with the thick pigment. Here I've got the pigment that's got a bit of water mixed into it. And then I get the really thick creamy pigment as well. And I paint that on over my pencil lines. I try to paint broken lines as well, so I'm not completely filling in the edge. So I try to just leave little broken edges where I can. I also did a bit more dry brushing. I need to reload. I painted in the edge of the brickwork here on the left-hand side with indigo and burnt sienna mixed together, but it's quite watery there. I did that on dry paper, and then I dropped a bit of the indigo on there while it was wet, and I spread it out with my damp brush, just to add a bit of interest and to cool the edge down. Here I'm painting the sepia ink on quite thick. That's on dry paper, but then I give it a squirt with a spray bottle and it spreads beautifully. And because it's wet just here, because I squirted it with the spray, I can paint the ink on there and it bleeds as well. With the bricks on the side, I worked on them individually. I wet each brick and then I started to add some texture with my brush. So using the dark mixtures, both the thick and the mixture with a bit of water mixed into it, just working on the wet paper. So here I'll show you a brick from start to finish. I wet it with water first. I used some burnt sienna. The burnt sienna was quite thin so that it spread over the paper. And here I've got the mixture of indigo and burnt sienna, and it's quite thin as well. Then I pick up the darker mixture that's got a bit more pigment in it. It's not the darkest, but it's the mixture that I mixed a bit of water into it. And then I switch to my rigger brush and I use the really, really thick pigment. This has got virtually no water in it. And then I use the rigger brush to move the paint around that's on the paper. And I moved it back up here to this area. I wet it with water and then I use the really thick pigment again. So you can see the dry brushing underneath. So now I'm adding a bit of detail over the top of that. Moving the paint around, creating some lines and cracks. This is my Rosemary & Co. Eradicator brush. I use this a lot when I want to try and remove highlights. So my paper is dry, the brush is wet. I wipe it over the paint and it removes it. I'm creating some highlights on the timber door. I use a tissue or paper towel to take off the excess paint. Gently rub, and then I use the paper towel. I also got my rigger brush and some of the ink, and I painted a few fine lines with that as well on the dry paper. I also used my damp brush to soften edges. I went back with my dark brown mixture and I dry brushed a bit of texture onto the brickwork above the door. Just using the side of the brush. I stood back and looked at it and decided that I wanted to deepen the shadow on the door. So I wet it with water and I got a bit more of the dark mixture and I painted that on. I didn't really want to cover over the granulated area, but I thought I'll put this on and then I'll put a bit more of the granulation fluid on there and hopefully I'll be able to bring some of it back. I took it down the bottom as well. I could still see a little bit of granulation, but I wanted a bit more, so I dropped some more of the fluid on there. And I waited for that to dry. And then I was happy with it. So I took that tape off from around the edges. Before I cut it off the board, I made sure that I didn't need to do anything else to it. And there it is there, cut off the board. Some other ways of using texture. You could use granulating pigments. You could also use a palette knife or the handle of your brush to scrape away thick paint to create some textural marks. You can even use really fine sandpaper to sand some texture into a dry wash. As you saw on this painting, I like to use paint at different consistencies, and I use my brush to create the texture that I want. Don't forget to watch those videos that I mentioned about using salt on your paintings and also the bloom video. I hope this was useful to you. Thanks for watching and I'll see you next week. Why?
You said, why should you include texture?
What's up there?
Okay.
So you want me to inflect?
Yes, inflect. And do an inflection a little bit further down here too.
Do you want to do it instead?
Yeah, that's contrast. You can break up the monotony with the flat areas. Why should you include texture in your watercolour painting? So,
why should you include texture? That's what you told me to do. Some other ways of using texture. Texture.